World War II began on September 1, 1939, when Adolf Hitler, standing before the German Reichstag, declared, "Tonight, for the first time, regular Polish soldiers have fired upon our territory." From that moment on, Poland's fate was no less grim. The invasion unleashed an unprecedented storm of destruction, with Warsaw reduced to rubble, its people subjected to brutal occupation, and its sovereignty erased from the map within weeks. On August 25, 1939, 5 days before the invasion of Poland, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a pact that would seal the country's fate. Despite their ideological differences, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin shared a common goal: the elimination of the Polish state. To this end, their foreign ministers, Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov, signed the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, known as the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. Although it officially established a commitment to non-aggression in secret, they agreed to divide Poland. Germany would control the west and Warsaw, while the Soviet Union would take the eastern part. Additionally, Stalin secured the freedom to expand his influence in the Baltic states, as well as in Bessarabia and Bukovina in Romania and in Karelia in Finland. However, the Soviet Union could not intervene immediately. At that time, the Red Army was engaged in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol against Japan and Manchukuo in the Far East, supporting its ally, Outer Mongolia, since May 1939. Until they consolidated their victory on that front and secured their Siberian rear, the Soviets could not divert troops to Europe. Meanwhile, Hitler prepared to launch his offensive against Poland without waiting for his ally. On August 30th, anticipating the imminent invasion, the Polish army ordered a general mobilization. However, in an effort to avoid a war similar to that of 1914, London and Paris pressured Polish authorities to back down, clinging to the remote possibility of a diplomatic solution. This decision allowed the Polish Navy to evacuate 3 of its most important destroyers, which left the Baltic Sea and crossed the Danish Strait toward the British Isles. This maneuver made it clear that for Poland, war was practically inevitable. Everything began on the night of August 31, 1939, with the so-called Operation Himmler. In an attempt to fabricate a pretext for the invasion, SS agents disguised as Polish insurgents attacked the Gleiwitz radio station in Upper Silesia. After subduing the employees and a police officer, they fired shots into the air and connected a microphone to broadcast messages in Polish against Germany. One of them declared, "Attention! This is Gleiwitz. The station is in Polish hands." With this staged event, the Third Reich justified the offensive that, the following day, would mark the beginning of World War II. Under the name Operation Fall Weiss, the German High Command entrusted the direction of the campaign against Poland to General Walter von Brauchitsch. The strategy was based on a 2-front attack. In the north, the army group commanded by Fedor von Bock would advance with the Third Army from East Prussia and the Fourth Army from Pomerania, aiming to encircle Warsaw and cut off access to the Baltic Sea. In the south, the army group led by Gerd von Rundstedt would launch its offensive with the 14th Army from Slovakia, while the 8th and 10th Armies would advance from Silesia to penetrate the Polish plains and destroy enemy forces. At the same time, within the Free State of Danzig, the German minority would rise up against the Polish government. Organized into the SS Heimwehr Danzig militia and led by Hans Goetze, these armed groups would carry out harassment actions against Polish authorities from within the city, thus facilitating the entry of German forces. The Wehrmacht deployed 1.8 million soldiers, 58 divisions, over 3,400 tanks, and 2,300 aircraft, while the Kriegsmarine contributed 84 ships. With a combined force of infantry, armored units and aviation, Germany prepared for a swift and overwhelming offensive against Poland. In 1939, the Polish army was far from the formidable force that had defeated the Soviet Union and other neighboring countries between 1918 and 1921. With a declining military budget, the modernization of its weaponry and the training of its officers had fallen behind. One of its greatest weaknesses was communication, as command structures remained highly centralized, a system implemented by President Józef Piłsudski and maintained unchanged by his successor, Marshal Edward Riedz-Śmigły. This structure meant that even the smallest decision had to be approved by the commander-in-chief, significantly slowing down operations in contrast to the German army, which encouraged officer autonomy. Another critical strategic mistake was the planning of Poland's defense. For 2 decades, Poland had prepared its eastern border for a possible Soviet invasion, but had not taken adequate measures to counter a German attack from the west. When Plan Z was activated to strengthen the border with the Reich, 2 crucial errors were made. The best units were deployed in the west without fortified defenses. The eastern border was left virtually unprotected, making it easy for the Red Army to intervene. Additionally, Poland's mobilization process was slow, requiring 12 to 15 days, a luxury it could not afford in the face of a rapid German assault. Another disadvantage was the country's ethnic diversity. Only 60% of the population was ethnically Polish, while the remaining 40%, comprising Germans, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Czechs, Slovaks, and Jews, had little interest in defending Poland, and in some cases even sabotaged the war effort. Given these circumstances, Poland's position at the start of the war was extremely vulnerable. Excessive patriotic enthusiasm was reflected in popular expressions such as, "We will conquer Berlin." Zrenia, a slogan that circulated widely among the civilian population in the weeks leading up to the conflict. The Polish army, consisting of 1 million soldiers, 880 tanks, and 1,334 aircraft, was organized into 39 divisions and 16 brigades, deployed across 3 main sectors from the Baltic Sea to Silesia, while reserve forces and the Border Defense Corps protected the rear. The brutal storm of steel, Germany unleashes hell on Poland. At 4:43 a.m. on September 1, 1939, 3 Junkers Stuka dive bombers soared over Poland at an altitude of over 3,500 meters. Their target, the Dirschau Bridge, a strategic crossing over the Vistula River. Leading the formation, Lieutenant Bruno Dilly adjusted his engine, closed the radiator flaps, and deployed the dive brakes before tilting his plane into a steep descent. From the ground, Polish sentries gazed at the sky in confusion, unable to identify the source of the unfamiliar hum. At just 900 meters from the target, Dilly released his bombs and skillfully pulled up. Seconds later, a powerful explosion shook the structure, reducing the bridge to rubble and destroying several nearby fortifications. That detonation not only marked the first aerial action of the German invasion, but also opened the gates to a conflict that, over the next 6 years, would claim more than 80 million lives. The Battle of Westerplatte, Poland's first stand. 5 minutes after the first shots of World War II, at 4:48 a.m., the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein emerged from the Baltic Sea and positioned itself in front of the Polish naval base at Westerplatte in Danzig. There, 210 Polish soldiers, under the command of Major Henryk Sucharski, defended the base with only 3 cannons and 4 mortars. As the first light of day broke, the battleship's massive 280mm guns opened fire on the base, reducing its structures to rubble within minutes. Shortly after, a combined German force of 1,725 soldiers launched an assault on Westerplatte. Among them, 225 naval infantry troops landed on the docks, while 1,500 SS Heimwehr Danzig militia fighters, led by Lieutenant Wilhelm Henningsen, attacked from Novi Port. However, the Polish defenders, taking cover behind the ruins of the bombardment, fiercely repelled the attackers, inflicting 82 casualties, killed and wounded on the Germans at the cost of 68 Polish losses. While Westerplatte resisted, the rest of Danzig quickly fell to the Germans. Most government buildings were seized with little resistance, except for the post office, where a group of employees and fighters, led by Konrad Guderski, held out for several hours. With the first light of September 1, 1939, more than 1,000 Luftwaffe aircraft crossed the Polish sky, launching a massive attack on strategic targets. The large bombers attacked from high altitude, while the fighters descended to strafe the runways. At Rakowitz Airport, at least 28 Polish aircraft were reduced to rubble before they could take off. After the initial bombings, German artillery unleashed intense fire along the Polish border, destroying fortifications and key defensive positions. Shortly after, the armored divisions, followed by the infantry, broke through the border barriers and began the invasion. From East Prussia, the Third Army advanced forcefully. crushing the Polish trenches and heading west, while the Fourth Army, departing from Pomerania, moved in the same direction with the objective of cutting off access to the Baltic seaports. By the end of the first day of World War II, Poland's situation was critical. Its forces had suffered intense bombardment from German artillery and attacks from the armoured trains Leopold, severely weakening their defensive lines. Much of its air force and navy had been neutralised both in the air and at sea, limiting its ability to respond. Although in Pomerania they managed to temporarily halt the enemy advance in the southern Carpathians and the Danzig corridor, German troops advanced almost without encountering resistance. On September 2, 1939, the second day of World War II began with a significant triumph for the Third Reich. The German forces of the Third and Fourth Armies managed to connect their lines, securing full control of the Danzig corridor. In the former Free State of Danzig, the German origin population joyfully welcomed the troops, celebrating what they considered a liberation. The greatest disaster of the day occurred in the so-called Battle of Pomorska. In a desperate attempt, the Polish cavalry launched a frontal charge against the German armoured units, relying on traditional combat tactics. However, their sabres and lances were useless against the cannons and machine guns of the panzer tanks, resulting in a total massacre, with the Polish units practically annihilated in the confrontation. In the early hours of September 3, 1939, London sent Berlin an ultimatum signed by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and King George VI, demanding the immediate withdrawal of German troops from Poland before 11 a.m. Receiving no response or changes in the situation, the deadline expired, and automatically the conflict with the Allies began. Due to the time difference, the first nation to declare war on Germany was New Zealand, followed by Australia, Great Britain, and France, among others. In the following days, more countries and territories under British and French rule joined the conflict, expanding what initially was a crisis in Danzig into a global-scale war. The twilight of Poland, the Soviet shadow falls from the east suddenly, and catching both the Polish army and its allies by surprise, the Soviet Union launched its invasion of Poland at dawn on September 17, 1939. Within hours, more than 500,000 Red Army soldiers crossed the border, advancing along a vast 1,300-kilometer front, stretching from Lithuania in the north to Romania in the south. The Soviet armored divisions pushed into Polish territory under the pretext of protecting the fraternal populations of Ukraine and Belarus. Organized into the Ukrainian and Belarusian fronts, their forces had an overwhelming number of tanks, vehicles, and infantry troops. The impact on the Polish High Command was devastating. At that moment, Polish forces were engaged in a desperate struggle against the German invasion, trying to execute their final defensive strategy, the Romanian Bridgehead Plan. This plan aimed to retreat as many troops as possible toward the Hungarian and Romanian borders, hoping to hold out until France and the United Kingdom intervened. However, Polish resistance was crumbling. The remaining units were no longer operating in a coordinated manner, and what was left of the army consisted of scattered groups of soldiers, isolated and trying to escape the German encirclement, to regroup with the forces still fighting. With most of its troops committed to the battle against Germany, the defense of the eastern border fell solely to the Border Protection Corps, KOP, some territorial defense units, and remnants of retreating forces. Facing this new Soviet threat, the Polish General Staff realized that the Romanian Bridgehead Plan was untenable and made a drastic decision: avoid any engagement with Soviet forces and focus entirely on evacuating soldiers to Romania and Hungary. From there, they hoped they could reach France or the United Kingdom to continue the fight against the Axis. The Red Army's assault from the rear marked the beginning of the final collapse of the Polish army. On September 19th, Soviet forces, advancing along a 1,500-kilometer front, captured Vilnius in the north and Pruzhany in the south, reaching the neutral Hungarian border. Meanwhile, in central Poland, German troops crushed the remaining resistance in the Bzura pocket, where the Poznan and Pomerania armies were completely annihilated. In this brutal battle, 20,000 Polish soldiers were killed and 170,000 were taken prisoner, while the Germans suffered 8,000 casualties, losing 50 tanks, 100 vehicles, and 20 artillery pieces. With the total occupation of Poland on October 6, 1939, The campaign ended in an absolute victory for both the Axis and the Soviet Union. For Germany, the triumph confirmed the effectiveness of the Blitzkrieg, allowing it to subjugate Poland in just 5 weeks, inflicting massive losses on its enemies while keeping its own casualties relatively low. This success served as a turning point for the German High Command, which analyzed the campaign and adjusted its strategy to further optimize the speed and mobility of its forces. With the lessons learned, Blitzkrieg was perfected to an almost unbeatable level, which in the following years would lead the Wehrmacht to conquer much of Europe and extend its dominance to North Africa. During the invasion of Poland, the country suffered around 2.3 million casualties, including dead, wounded and prisoners, as well as the loss of a large part of its military equipment. In comparison, the Axis and the USSR recorded about 53,000 casualties between dead and wounded, along with the destruction of hundreds of tanks, aircraft and vehicles. The campaign ended with total domination by the invading forces and the final fall of Poland. More than 2.1 million Polish soldiers were captured, with the majority falling into Soviet hands. The USSR took 1.5 million prisoners, of whom 250,000 died in gulags or were executed, including the 20,000 shot in the Katyn Massacre by the NKVD. Germany held 600,000 and Slovakia a small number, with many Polish prisoners also perishing in concentration camps and during Operation Tannenberg. Despite the occupation, 105,000 managed to escape to neutral countries such as Hungary, Romania, and the Baltic states, from where many traveled to England to join the Polish government in exile and continue the fight against the Axis. After the conquest of Poland and the joint victory of the Axis and the Soviet Union, both powers celebrated their triumph with a series of military parades. In Brest-Litovsk, German and Soviet soldiers marched along Unie Lubelskiej Street under banners bearing the swastika and the hammer and sickle, in a ceremony led by Generals Gerd von Rundstedt and Semyon Krivoshein. In Warsaw, the Wehrmacht organized a parade in the presence of Adolf Hitler, while in Komansa, German troops participated in a march alongside the Slovak army. In Lviv, German units paraded alongside Ukrainian militias who had collaborated in the campaign. After the invasion, Poland ceased to exist as a state, and its territory was divided among 4 nations: Germany, the Soviet Union, Slovakia, and neutral Lithuania, which also received a portion. Germany annexed the western regions with a German majority population and established the general government, an occupational administration for the rest of the country. The Soviet Union incorporated the eastern territories into the republics of Ukraine and Belarus, while Slovakia took small strips in the south. Lithuania, in turn, gained control of Vilnius. Ghettos of Poland, the sealed fate of the Jews. After Adolf Hitler's occupation of Poland in September 1939, the country fell under German administration following a rapid military campaign. At that time, Jews made up approximately 10% of the population. They immediately became targets of violence, humiliation, dispossession, and arbitrary abductions by German soldiers for forced labor. Driven by a racist and anti-Semitic ideology and determined to establish a new order in Europe, the Germans segregated Jews from the rest of the population by confining them to ghettos. These were typically located in poor urban districts, where Jews were forced to live behind fences, walls, or barbed wire barriers. The time given for relocation to the ghettos was limited, forcing Jewish families, many of whom had lived in their homes for generations, to quickly pack their belongings and seek refuge in extremely overcrowded spaces. Uncertain of how long they would remain there or under what conditions, they were forced to make difficult decisions about what to take with them. Completely isolated and with no access to means of livelihood, Jews were left in a state of extreme vulnerability, exposed to misery, starvation, disease, and degradation. The Nazi regime established approximately 1,200 ghettos across Eastern Europe. These areas were originally intended as a temporary measure while Nazi authorities developed their strategy for what they called the Jewish problem. Rather than ensuring the survival of those confined, ghettos were characterized by extremely harsh living conditions, with no access to basic resources or adequate means of subsistence. As a result of poverty, lack of hygiene, overcrowding, and food shortages, tens of thousands of Jews perished in these enclaves. While the conditions led to a very high mortality rate, it remains unclear whether the Germans initially intended for the ghettos to function as extermination sites on their own. In 1940, thousands of Jewish families were forcibly removed from their homes in Warsaw and relocated to a designated area of the city. The assigned zone coincided with an old medieval Jewish quarter, whose origins dated back to the Duchy of Poland. At first, those displaced were still allowed some freedom of movement, the ability to trade, and a life relatively similar to what they had before the war. However, uncertainty about the future became increasingly evident. Everything changed on November 2, 1940, when SS units stormed the area and prohibited entry and exit without prior notice. Within hours, workers began constructing a stone and brick wall, enclosing the area with a 4-meter-high, 18-kilometer-long barrier. The construction, completed on November 16th, marked the beginning of total isolation for the Jewish population. Initially, more than 300,000 people were trapped inside this sector, a number that continued to increase, reaching 500,000 in the following years during the height of World War II. The Warsaw Ghetto, covering 4.5% of the city, became the largest in Europe in both size and population. Its rectangular layout, approximately 4.5 kilometers long and 2.5 kilometers wide, divided the area into two main sections, the large ghetto and the small ghetto, connected by a wooden bridge crossing Clodna Street. Within this perimeter were key streets and strategic points, such as Niska Street, home to the Jewish Council, Klamaki Square, the site of the main synagogue, and Twarda Street, where the hospital was located. Other important streets included Lesno Street, the commercial hub, Storki Street, leading to the Warsaw North Station, and the more privileged areas on Wielka and Siena Streets. Additionally, the Posen-Berlin highway ran through the area, allowing vehicles and buses to pass, from which German tourists observed and photographed Jewish prisoners as if they were an exotic attraction. The overcrowding inside the ghetto was severe, with more than 1,300 people per 100 square meters. The population density averaged 7 people per tiny room, measuring just 4 to 6 square meters, with up to 30 individuals crammed into a single apartment. In total, the ghetto housed 1,500 residential buildings and 43 food warehouses. Entry and exit were strictly controlled through 14 guarded checkpoints, manned by SS soldiers and Polish Blue Police agents, except for one corner that faced the Vistula River. The administration of the ghetto was handed over to the Warsaw Jewish Council, Judenrat, led by Adam Cherniakow, who assembled a group of intellectuals and community leaders, many of them traditionalists or Zionists. This governing body, composed of 6,000 employees across 30 departments, was dominated by the wealthy Jewish elite, creating a stark contrast with the majority of the ghetto's inhabitants who lived in extreme poverty. To maintain internal order, the Jewish police was established, led by Józef Szeryński, and consisting of 2,500 officers. Dressed in civilian clothes with distinctive armbands and armed with batons, these officers enforced a system marked by corruption and abuse of power, often oppressing their own people. The Warsaw Ghetto became a place of extreme confinement where the Jewish population lived under totalitarian control. The majority of its inhabitants could not leave the enclosure, except for those selected for forced labor under the strict supervision of the SS or the Polish Blue Police. Within its limits, daily life was full of hardships. The electricity and gas supply only functioned during certain hours of the night and early morning, and means of transportation were practically non-existent, except for a modest horse-drawn tram that ran through some streets. Correspondence with the outside world was prohibited, although many managed to establish clandestine networks to exchange letters with relatives abroad. Even something as simple as sitting in the shade of a tree required paying a fee to its owners due to the scarcity of vegetation in the area. Despite the restrictions, education remained an essential activity, allowing Jewish children to continue their studies in community schools. Institutions such as the Yehudia School welcomed numerous students, while the municipal orphanage, under the direction of Dr. Janusz Korczak, offered refuge to hundreds of orphans. However, the shortage of food and medicine was already taking a heavy toll on the population, and in 1940 alone, more than 1,000 Jews died due to misery and lack of resources. The ghetto was also a center of intense cultural and educational activity. Publications were created in various languages, from Hebrew to Yiddish and Polish, keeping communication alive within the community. Libraries became gathering spaces where adults and young people sought solace in literature. Music and theater also played an important role, with violin concerts and theatrical performances organized by orphans, highlighting works such as The Postman of the King by Rabindranath Tagore. On a religious level, the ghetto housed a diversity of beliefs. The Jewish community gathered in synagogues for Torah readings and religious celebrations, while Catholic Jews, who numbered more than 1,700 people, found a place of worship in the Church of All Saints and the Church of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. These churches had gardens where the faithful could pray and participate in ceremonies, providing a small respite within the harsh reality of the ghetto. The Warsaw Ghetto, the walled hell. In 1941, the situation in the Warsaw Ghetto began to deteriorate severely due to the lack of supplies. The constant confiscation of food and essential goods by the SS left the population on the brink of starvation. In an attempt to contain the crisis, Gauleiter Hans Frank assigned the management of resources to Hans Bibo, a German officer, and Alberto Nierenstein, a Jewish nutrition specialist. A rationing system was implemented to distribute small amounts of food and ensure salary payments to the thousands of Jews employed in factories producing goods for the Nazi army. Despite these measures, conditions in the ghetto remained extremely precarious. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 further worsened the crisis. With the Reich's efforts focused on the war against the Soviets, the few remaining supplies in the ghetto were redirected to the Eastern Front. The population was forced to survive on whatever they could find: potatoes, flour, or in many cases, absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, a typhus epidemic spread rapidly due to poor hygiene and widespread malnutrition. Every day, hundreds of lifeless bodies were collected from the streets, where they piled up without immediate burial. It is estimated that around 5,500 people died monthly from starvation, though there were periods when the death toll exceeded 15,000 victims. In 1942, the crisis reached its most critical point with the arrival of winter. Thousands of Jews continued to die from starvation, adding to the new deportees from Germany, who, already weak and without access to food, could not survive. In the first months of the year, more than 5,000 people died solely from lack of food. Desperation consumed the ghetto, and on February 20th, a horrifying event occurred. The first documented case of cannibalism was reported when a mother, in an act of extreme desperation, fed on the corpse of her child, who had died of starvation the previous day. This episode reflected the immense suffering endured by the population, who faced a slow and silent death within the walls of the ghetto. The food shortage in the Warsaw Ghetto was the result of an extremely unequal distribution system imposed by the general government, under the command of Gauleiter Hans Frank. The caloric allocation reflected the systematic discrimination against Jews. While a German army or SS soldier received 2,130 daily calories, and foreigners residing in neutral countries were allocated 1,790, Polish citizens had access to only 634 calories, while Jews were relegated to a meager 184. In addition to this unjust distribution, the ration prices for Jews were disproportionately high. While a German paid 0.80 zloty for certain foods, and a Pole paid 2.60, Jews were forced to pay up to 5.90 zloty. Due to these conditions, an average family in the ghetto had to survive weekly on minimal rations, which included less than a kilogram of bread, small amounts of sugar, jam, and fat, and on rare occasions, some potatoes, meat, or fish. Faced with this food crisis, the black market and smuggling became the only alternatives for obtaining food. Children played a key role in these clandestine networks, as their small size allowed them to slip through cracks in the walls and evade Nazi guards' surveillance. Adults also found ingenious ways to smuggle goods into the ghetto, digging tunnels under foundations, hiding merchandise in bricks, or throwing bags of food over barbed wire fences. The least controlled areas for these illegal exchanges included Kozla and Świętodzierskie streets, as well as the Jewish cemetery, where smugglers once managed to bring in 23 cows without being detected. Despite extreme repression and Nazi control, some humanitarian organizations managed to provide aid to the ghetto's inhabitants. International relief groups, such as the Joint Distribution Committee and the Jewish Social Mutual Aid, succeeded in supplying food and assistance to approximately 160,000 people, helping to temporarily alleviate the hunger and desperation that plagued the community. In 1942, despair took hold of the Warsaw Ghetto. News of the German retreat from Rostov on the Eastern Front had briefly sparked optimism among its inhabitants, as in Yiddish, the name of the city could be interpreted as Roshtov, or good beginning. However, that illusion quickly crumbled when the German army regained control of the city, reaffirming the perception that the war still offered no hope of liberation. Amidst uncertainty and daily suffering, many sought distractions to help endure adversity. In this context of forced creativity, unusual solutions emerged, such as making lamps out of cigarettes or improvising contraceptive methods using pacifiers. Brutality was a constant presence in the ghetto. SS soldiers, Polish Blue police agents, and Jewish police auxiliaries systematically abused the inhabitants. Unjustified beatings, extreme punishments, and arbitrary executions were part of daily life. Even trivial acts, such as failing to remove one's hat in front of an officer, could provoke a violent attack. One of the most terrifying cases was that of a Nazi guard stationed on the bridge over Klodner Street, nicknamed Frankenstein, who killed one Jew every day for mere entertainment. The terror was so overwhelming that when a young girl was asked what she wanted to be when she grew up, she resignedly answered, "A dog, because the guards liked them." However, not all guards shared this cruelty. Some, at their posts, turned a blind eye to children trying to enter or leave the ghetto clandestinely, and even accepted small food bribes to let them escape. Chaos in the ghetto intensified in mid-1942 with the rise of the black market and the growth of criminal gangs that did not hesitate to attack and rob their own people. In an attempt to curb crime, the Jewish Council and Jewish police tightened control over the population. One of the most controversial measures was the opening of a prison with a capacity for 350 people. However, overcrowding was immediate, and within weeks, the number of inmates exceeded 1,200. Conditions were so inhumane that within the first 8 days, 22 prisoners died from being abandoned without water or food. To worsen the situation, since many smugglers were children, a children's prison was established where, at its most critical moment, up to 500 minors were imprisoned. Despite the extreme conditions, Jewish resistance within the ghetto did not take shape until the young Zionist Yitzhak Zuckerman gathered a small group of followers. At the same time, another organization, the Bund, emerged, promoting a vision of Judaism from a social democratic perspective. However, attempts at cooperation between the two factions failed, and each operated separately. Zuckerman's followers began publishing a clandestine newspaper called Yedias, while the Bund pursued its own agenda. The Gestapo soon detected these activities, and on April 17, 1942, it organized a raid that dismantled the first Zionist cell. A total of 51 militants were captured and publicly executed before the terrified population of the ghetto, in a brutal demonstration of Nazi control over any form of resistance. On July 22, 1942, the mass deportation of Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto began as part of the implementation of the final solution. That day, SS General Hermann Höfel notified the Jewish Council that it had to organize the evacuation of the ghetto under the pretext of resettlement in Eastern Europe. The order left no room for negotiation and demanded immediate collaboration from the local administration. However, Adam Cherniakov, leader of the Jewish Council, rejected the instruction and refused to facilitate the deportation of his community. Faced with his refusal, the Germans took drastic measures. During the night, units of the Polish Blue Police and battalions of collaborators from Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia stormed the streets of the ghetto. With extreme brutality, they broke into homes, dragged entire families out of their houses, and subjected the population to beatings and humiliations. The pressure and horror of the situation pushed Cherniakov to the brink of emotional collapse. With no alternatives and consumed by despair, he wrote a farewell letter and committed suicide by ingesting poison, refusing to be complicit in the imminent massacre. At dawn on July 23rd, the Nazi plan was set in motion without opposition. The Jewish police, along with occupation forces and collaborationist militias, began a mass roundup. Thousands of people were forcibly removed from their homes, taken to the train station and crammed into freight cars bound for Treblinka, where they would be murdered in gas chambers. On that first day alone, 5,000 Jews were deported. The raids continued relentlessly, with daily arrests and mass deportations that emptied the ghetto at an alarming rate. Within weeks, more than 66,000 people were sent to their deaths, sealing one of the cruelest episodes in the history of the Jewish genocide. During the summer of 1942, the Warsaw Ghetto witnessed one of the largest and most devastating deportations of the final solution. Over the course of August, more than 140,000 Jews were forcibly taken and sent to the extermination camps of Treblinka, Auschwitz, and Majdanek. To facilitate transportation, the Nazis resorted to deception, offering bread and jam to beggars and the most destitute, promising better conditions outside the ghetto. Among the victims of this cruel manipulation were the 200 children of the municipal orphanage, who were led in a line to the station by their teacher, Janusz Korczak. The group marched in apparent calm, singing and carrying backpacks with small rations of bread and water, unaware that their destination would be death in Treblinka. In September, the machinery of extermination continued without pause. Another 54,000 Jews were captured and transported to the Nazi camps, with the last train departing on the 21st, carrying more than 2,000 people. By then, the ghetto had lost the majority of its population, and the number of deportees had risen to hundreds of thousands. The rate of expulsions increased alarmingly within weeks. Initially, the convoys transported around 5,000 people per day, but the frequency quickly escalated to 10,000 daily deportees. As a result of the 500,000 original inhabitants of the ghetto, at least 400,000 were sent to their deaths in gas chambers. Only 70,000 Jews remained in Warsaw after this wave of expulsions, though most had no guarantee of survival. While some were forced into slave labor in armament factories run by Walter Turbans, another 8,000 were sent to work in various industrial centers of the Third Reich. The impact of the operation was devastating. Apart from the thousands of deportees, conditions within the ghetto deteriorated rapidly. More than 10,000 people died from starvation, disease, and the violence inflicted by the occupying forces. In total, at least 265,000 Jews were transported to camps like Treblinka and Auschwitz in just a few months, in what became one of the largest massacres perpetrated during World War II. At the beginning of 1943, the inhabitants of the Warsaw Ghetto realized that deportation did not mean relocation, but a death sentence. News of mass executions in Treblinka and Auschwitz left no room for doubt. Those taken from the ghetto never returned. Faced with this reality, a group of Jews decided that the only alternative was to resist, even if it meant confronting one of the most powerful armies in the world with limited resources. Resistance did not emerge immediately, nor from a single faction, but rather as the result of the union of various movements with opposing ideologies but a common enemy. From Zionist circles to communists, social democrats of the Bund and more conservative sectors, contacts were established to coordinate an armed uprising. Despite their political differences, they managed to unite efforts with a clear purpose: to confront the Nazis and prevent the remaining ghetto population from being annihilated. The number of fighters reached approximately 1,000, divided into small clandestine groups scattered across different sectors of the ghetto. Lacking sophisticated weaponry, they resorted to what was available: stolen pistols, improvised weapons, homemade explosives, and gasoline for incendiary attacks. Mila and Zamenhof streets became the center of the insurgency, where the few available weapons were stored, and ambushes against German troops were planned. What at first seemed like a desperate act transformed into one of the first major urban uprisings against Nazi occupation. On April 18, 1943, Jewish resistance fighters launched a surprise attack on the SS in the Warsaw Ghetto, ambushing them from rooftops and workshops, forcing the Nazis and the Jewish police to retreat. As a sign of victory, the insurgents raised the Polish flag and the insignia of Israel in Muranowska Square. Heinrich Himmler ordered an immediate response, sending General Jürgen Stroop with 2,090 soldiers, including Waffen-SS, Polish collaborators and Baltic auxiliaries, supported by armored vehicles and artillery. The battle for the ghetto had begun. On April 19, 1943, a day after the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Axis forces launched a massive offensive against the insurgents. Hundreds of German soldiers and their Polish, Ukrainian, Baltic and Jewish collaborators stormed the ghetto, backed by armored vehicles and artillery. The Luftwaffe bombed from the air, reducing entire buildings to rubble. Despite this brutal assault, Jewish fighters fiercely resisted using rifles, street traps and Molotov cocktails, even thrown by women who propelled themselves from rooftops with ropes tied to chimneys. The losses were devastating for the defenders, but their resistance was so effective that Nazi troops were forced to retreat. For 4 days, the Germans failed to capture a single building, and more than 300 grenadiers fled the battlefield, humiliated by the tenacity of the insurgents. The battle for the ghetto lasted for a month, from April to May 1943, the same amount of time the Third Reich had taken to conquer France, Belgium and the Netherlands in 1940. The Nazis advanced slowly, forced to take every street, every building and every room at a high cost. With the surface reduced to a hellscape of ruins and flames, Jewish fighters took refuge in basements, tunnels and sewers to continue the resistance. However, the Germans resorted to ruthless tactics. They flooded underground passages with water, released tear gas, and unleashed hunting dogs to track down fugitives. Those who emerged were executed on the spot. Those who tried to hide on the upper floors of the remaining buildings also found no refuge. The SS used flamethrowers to exterminate those desperately clinging to balconies, while soldiers made bets on who could shoot the most targets. Finally, the Germans opted for total destruction. The last structures were demolished with explosives, wiping out any trace of resistance. Outnumbered and outgunned, the last fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto fell one by one, whether killed in combat, captured by the Waffen-SS, or forced to surrender. Only a few managed to escape through the city and reach the forests of Poland, where they continued the fight in secrecy. On May 4th, 456 insurgents holding out in the Schultz and Walter Tubben's factories were forced to surrender. Days later, on May 8th, an underground shelter in the city centre was discovered, resulting in the capture of 4,000 people. On May 15th, the Germans detonated a synagogue, burying 87 fighters and taking dozens of prisoners. The resistance continued until May 26, 1943, when the SS demolished the Great Synagogue at 8:15 p.m., symbolizing the definitive end of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Warsaw Uprising, the last battle for freedom. On August 1, 1944, Warsaw began its day in apparent normality. Parks filled with strollers, churches welcomed crowds of worshippers, and shops worked tirelessly, selling out their products due to high demand. No one suspected that within hours the city would become a battlefield. The Armia Krajowa, the main Polish resistance force, had set W hour for 5 p.m., synchronizing the start of the uprising with the moment when workers left the factories. However, events unfolded sooner than expected. In the Żoliborz district at 1:50 p.m., a group of insurgents led by Captain Zdzisław Sierpiński was caught by a German patrol while transporting a shipment of weapons. Allowing the Nazi soldiers to alert their superiors would jeopardize the entire operation, so the fighters did not hesitate to attack. Within seconds, several grenades hit the enemy truck, destroying it and eliminating its occupants. On August 1, 1944, at 5 p.m., Warsaw erupted in rebellion. The Armia Krajowa executed its insurrection plan across different districts of the city, attacking German troops in the streets and surprising their defenses with a series of coordinated ambushes. As they advanced, they erected barricades, seized strategic positions, and fought fiercely against the occupying forces. However, the battle came at a high cost, as the clashes caused numerous casualties among the civilian population. In the early hours of the uprising, the insurgents managed to secure several key locations. They took control of the power plant, the postal system, and the train station in the Praga district. They also liberated 50 Jewish prisoners held by the SS in the dungeons of Umschlagplatz. One of the most symbolic acts of the day was carried out by the Kalinsky Battalion, whose fighters stormed the Prudential skyscraper, the tallest structure in the city, where they raised the Polish flag as a defiant challenge to Nazi rule. At the end of the day, the situation remained uncertain. Although the Poles had made significant advances, they had also suffered enormous losses. Around 2,000 insurgents had died in combat, while German casualties were estimated at 400. Additionally, several key enemy strongholds, such as the Citadel, the Narbuta Police Barracks and the Brule Palace, remained intact, foreshadowing a prolonged and brutal fight in the coming days. On August 2, 1944, one day after the start of the Warsaw Uprising, German forces launched their first major counteroffensive in the city. The 2nd Panzer Battalion of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division advanced through the streets with armored vehicles, using Polish civilians as human shields, forcing them to march at the front of their columns to deter enemy fire. For a time, the strategy proved effective, as the insurgents hesitated to shoot at their own countrymen. However, upon realizing there was no other option, the fighters opened fire, causing the deaths of many hostages, but also eliminating a significant number of German soldiers and tank crews. That same day, the resistance achieved important victories in various parts of the city. A combined force of the Armia Krajowa, Armia Ludowa, and the National Armed Forces managed to capture the National Bank and the Nordwasser police station, two key positions for urban control. Meanwhile, in the Wola district, a group of insurgents ambushed and destroyed two Tiger tanks with explosives as they advanced through Gazia Street, temporarily halting the German advance in that sector. On August 3rd, the Wehrmacht intensified its offensive with a devastating bombardment of the Wola district, using a Panzerzüge armored train and a squadron of Heinkel He 111 bombers. The Germans leveled large parts of the city, causing numerous casualties and destroying strategic buildings. As Warsaw burned under enemy fire, the Polish president in exile, Stanisław Mikołajczyk, traveled to Moscow to meet with Joseph Stalin in an attempt to gain Soviet support. However, Stalin's responses were discouraging. He announced that the USSR would annex eastern Poland in exchange for ceding German territory in the west, and made it clear that the Red Army would not intervene in the battle for Warsaw. Despite this setback, Mikołajczyk returned to London, hoping that the Polish Parachute Brigade, stationed in England, could be deployed to support the uprising. One of the most astonishing episodes of the early days of the uprising took place on Karolkowa Street, where insurgents managed to immobilize two Panther tanks on a barricade. Seizing the opportunity, the fighters launched a barrage of Molotov cocktails and Piat anti-tank weapon fire, eliminating the crews and capturing both vehicles. The tanks were repainted in the colors of the Polish flag and put into service for the resistance. One of them, nicknamed Magda, was used to break down the walls of the Gesioka concentration camp, also known as the Goose Farm. The operation was a success. The prisoners, mostly Jews, Poles, and some Greeks, were liberated, and many immediately joined the resistance, including Henryk Lederman, the last surviving fighter in Warsaw from the 1943 Ghetto Uprising. On August 4, 1944, German forces launched their first major offensive against the Ochota and Wola districts, using punitive troops and collaborationist units to carry out the attack. The Kaminsky Brigade, Rona, composed of White Russians under the command of Yuri Frollo, advanced alongside the 36th Dirlewanger Grenadier Division, a notorious unit of ex-convicts. The Dirlewanger troops managed to breach the barricade on Wolska Street, which was defended by Polish Socialist Party militiamen. What followed was a series of atrocities that terrified the civilian population. The Dirlewanger soldiers stormed the University of Warsaw, murdering several professors at number 5 Nowy Zjazd Street, and attacked the Marie Curie Institute, where nurses were victims of extreme violence. In the Ochota district, Rona forces carried out mass rapes of women and girls, while other SS units summarily executed hundreds of people. In Mokotów, 600 political prisoners were shot without trial, 17 Jesuit priests were murdered on Bagatella Street, and several captured insurgents were executed at the Ursus factory. On August 5th, one of the most horrifying massacres of the uprising took place. Members of the 36th Dirlewanger Grenadier Division stormed the Plocker Hospital and murdered all the patients and medical staff. Shortly after, 1,000 patients from St. Lazarus Hospital on Lesno Street suffered the same fate. At the photography factory on Wolska Street, Everyone seeking refuge inside was mercilessly exterminated. The killings did not stop there. Over the following days, the Dirlewanger troops, Kaminsky Brigade collaborators, and soldiers of the 111th Azerbaijani Infantry Regiment perpetrated a bloodbath, leaving a terrifying death toll of 40,000 civilians murdered. From August 6, 1944, the Polish resistance came under brutal siege when German General Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski ordered the mass deportation of civilians to internment camps, particularly in Wola, where 35,000 people died due to executions, crossfire, or inhumane conditions. By August 8th, the insurgents still controlled Mokotów, Żoliborz, and the Campinos and Kabaki forests, but they depended on scarce supplies dropped by British and South African aircraft, while the Red Army, stationed on the other side of the Vistula, ignored their calls for help. On August 9th, the Germans launched a massive offensive against Wola and the former Jewish ghetto, supported by Nebelwerfer bombardments, heavy artillery, and an armoured train. While the Dirlewanger division seized the royal castle, 5,500 Polish fighters held their ground at the Kamla factory and the Old Town until August 12th, when they were forced out and lost the 2 Panther tanks they had captured. Meanwhile, in Kaliska, the Kaminsky Brigade and German armoured units razed fortified buildings and secured control of the area. On August 12, 1944, Axis forces attempted another assault on the former Jewish ghetto, reinforced by German troops, 2 Azerbaijani battalions, and an armoured unit equipped with Stu-G3 and Hetzer tank destroyers. However, the Polish resistance managed to halt their advance. That same day, a captured Goliath remote-controlled vehicle exploded accidentally on Kalinsky Street, killing 300 people. Meanwhile, outside Warsaw, on August 18th, the German Ninth Army launched a counteroffensive against Konstantin Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front, forcing the Soviets to retreat 80 kilometers from the outskirts of the capital to the opposite bank of the Vistula. With their advance halted, the Red Army could only offer limited aid to the Armia Krajowa, airdropping supplies and ammunition in Levela Square, and sending 2 radio operators to maintain communication with the insurgents. By late August and early September 1944, Warsaw had become a field of ruins where the struggle for survival was as harsh as the war itself. Relentless artillery and air bombardments pounded the city, reducing entire buildings to rubble. The insurgents and civilians barely survived on the limited supplies dropped by British and South African aircraft, though many of these packages fell into German hands or were rendered useless in inaccessible areas. With no water, food, or sufficient medical supplies, the resistance was weakening rapidly. The brutality of German troops and their allies only intensified the suffering. The 36th SS Dirlewanger Division, infamous for its sadism, along with Osttruppen units and the 111th Azerbaijani Infantry Regiment, spread terror through indiscriminate killings and violence against women. Among the most ruthless groups was the Kaminsky Brigade, whose atrocities were so extreme that even the SS took action against them. Its leader, Bronislaw Kaminsky, was arrested and executed along with his lieutenant, Ilya Shavikin, accused of looting and abusing German citizens, a punishment that was more of an internal purge than a pursuit of justice. On September 1, 1944, marking the 5th anniversary of the start of the war, the Soviet Union publicly announced its decision not to intervene in Warsaw. They justified their inaction by claiming that their priority was the campaign in the Balkans and the Carpathians, abandoning the Polish resistance to its fate. While the Red Army remained inactive on the eastern bank of the Vistula, the Germans took advantage of the situation to reinforce their positions with the arrival of the German Ninth Army and the Hungarian Second Corps. The Western powers reacted with frustration to Soviet inaction and pressured Stalin to intervene, but the Kremlin only pretended to make an effort to help. Some Red Army units advanced slightly into the suburbs of Warsaw, but without any real intention of launching an offensive. As the days passed, it became clear that the fate of the Polish resistance was sealed and that the city was doomed to fight alone until its last breath. On September 25, 1944, a truce allowed for the evacuation of 9,000 civilians in exchange for the surrender of Mokotów, which was handed over on September 26. On September 27th, the Hermann Göring Panzer Division resumed its offensive, eliminating pockets of resistance and capturing the Campinos forest on the 30th. That same day, after an agreement, Żoliborz was surrendered, with the evacuation of 15,000 civilians and the surrender of 800 insurgents. By late September 1944, the Armia Krajowa had suffered 1,000 casualties and was reduced to a small perimeter of 5 to 8 kilometers in central Warsaw. With the Red Army remaining idle in Praga and no Western support, the insurgents chose to negotiate with General Erich von Dembach-Zelewski. On October 1st, General Tadeusz Bohr-Komorowski initiated the talks, which culminated on October 2nd with the official surrender at 7 p.m. After 63 days of resistance, 11,600 Polish fighters, including 2,000 women, laid down their arms, marking the end of the Warsaw Uprising. The prisoners captured in Warsaw by Axis forces were treated as combatants under the Geneva Convention, allowing them to be sent to internment camps in Murnau, Sandbostel and Woldenberg under the supervision of the International Red Cross. However, the fate was far worse for the more than 500,000 civilians expelled from the city, who wandered aimlessly across Poland or were deported to Germany. While some were liberated by the Allies months later, nearly 100,000 were sent to the Ravensbrück and Mauthausen concentration camps, where they were used as forced labor. The fate of Warsaw was even more tragic. In reprisal for the uprising, Adolf Hitler ordered the city's complete destruction, and between October and December 1944, special demolition units reduced the city to rubble using dynamite and flamethrowers. Cultural and historical landmarks were systematically wiped out. Additionally, all essential infrastructure, including bridges, train stations, hospitals, factories and schools, was demolished, leaving 97% of Warsaw in ruins. On January 17, 1945, Soviet troops, along with the Polish First Army, entered a completely devastated Warsaw. With no German resistance, the city quickly fell under the control of the Polish Committee of National Liberation, a Moscow-aligned body that established a communist government under Soviet influence. In this new regime, former Armia Krajowa fighters were persecuted and declared enemies of the state. Thus began the era of the People's Republic of Poland, a communist regime that lasted nearly 4 decades, until the collapse of the Soviet system in 1989.